I appreciate the opportunity and am honored at the opportunity to be here speaking to this group of people. Many of you I've known for a number of years. This is an organization that I respect quite a bit. Carolinas AGC is probably one of the best managed and most influential trade and professional organizations in the state of North Carolina, and I'm not trying to blow smoke up your dress, but those of you who've been in leadership positions know that that is in fact the case. It was the Spanish philosopher Jorge Santayana who said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So before we begin any kind of discussion about public infrastructure in North Carolina, let's take for just a few seconds, let's go back to the past and remember it. In researching this subject, I learned that our infrastructure is a result of lotteries, tolls, taxes, and many other ways of funding throughout the state. We proudly boast that North Carolina opened the first public university in the nation in 1795, but did you know that the first construction of that building was financed by a lottery? North Carolina was never a great state of wealth, and our yeoman ancestors weren't fond of taxes, so alternative funding sources were often needed. Following the economic stagnation our state encountered following the Revolutionary War, people saw the need for better ways to move goods and services across the state, and a series of plank roads were constructed across North Carolina. During the 1850s, we built more than 500 miles of plank roads in North Carolina, and we paid for them by charging tolls. Listen to this. One rider on horseback paid half a cent a mile. A teamster with 2 horses paid 2 cents a mile. 3 horses paid 3 cents, and a team of 6 paid 4 cents per mile. Now, during this same period of time, railroads obviously became a faster and better way of hauling freight and people, and in 1848, our General Assembly passed authorizing legislation for the North Carolina Railroad, which formally opened in 1856 with a 233-mile track between Charlotte and Goldsboro. Taxpayers owned 2/3 of that railroad, with private investors owning 1/3. I have hanging in my office a great big $1,000 coupon bond, which was signed by then Governor William Holden to help pay for the western portion of that railroad. Unfortunately, there were charges of corruption, and Holden was impeached, and there was a subsequent bankruptcy of the railroad, but that's another story for another day. In 1839, the legislature passed the North Carolina Public School Act and a resolution for a referendum to modify the Constitution. It passed in all but 7 counties in our state. The legislature had previously established a literary fund. That's how the first schools got funded, a literary fund consisting of bank stocks, proceeds from the sale of state lands, dividends, license fees, taxes, and money from the federal government. It was several years thereafter, however, before we actually got into the construction of public schools in North Carolina. Skip now to 1921. Cameron Morrison was our governor, and half of his inaugural speech focused on roads. He became known as the Good Roads Governor, urging the legislature to pass and the public to approve a $50 million bond package. Imagine $50 million in 1921 to build 5,500 miles of roads in our state. It was funded by automobile and gasoline taxes. In 1923, he came back, passed another $15 million for roads. Morrison also got the legislature to approve $20 million in bonds for improvements to higher education and for the state's charitable institutions. Fast forward again to 1949, some of us, unfortunately, are old enough to remember W. Carr Scott, who was our governor, who promised to build farm-to-market roads in North Carolina and get us out of the mud. So we approved at that time a massive $200 million bond program. And of course, the granddaddy of all bond programs in North Carolina was the 2000 passage of the $3.1 billion higher education bond in our state. Now, we could talk about the creation of the Research Triangle Park, the North Carolina Biotechnology Center, and other projects like that that greatly accelerated our economic growth. And while it is difficult to try to generalize, I think I'm fairly safe in saying that during times when we were the Rip Van Winkle state, we weren't paying very much attention to our public infrastructure needs. And during those times when we were the Dixie Dynamo state, it was partially due to our investments in infrastructure. We have a history of using bonds, taxes, tolls, and lotteries to build everything from airports, water and sewer systems, public parks, help with industrial projects, build hospitals, and lots of schools and other buildings. So with that trip down memory lane, let's look now at the present and peek ahead a little bit to the future. Even in this recessionary period, North Carolina is growing at the rate of about 100,000 citizens a year. The Office of State Budget and Management projects it by the year 2030 will grow from our present population of about 9.6 million people to some 11.6 million people. We will be the 8th largest state in population in the nation in year 2030. But since 2000 and that higher education bond package, we've done practically nothing to address our growing needs for public infrastructure. The American Society for Civil Engineers periodically releases a report card for public infrastructure. In their 2009 update, listen to how they graded our state. D+ on airports, C- for bridges, D for dams, B- for drinking water, C for rails, D- for roads, C- for schools, C- for stormwater, C+ for wastewater. Now, this same group is getting ready to release another update on that report card on March 19th, rating our national infrastructure. And sometime in May, they're going to release an update on the North Carolina infrastructure. But since we hadn't done very much since that last report was released, we can only suspect that our report card grades are going to be even lower than they were before in 2009. So what does all this mean in terms of dollars? To bring our airports to good or excellent, we need to spend $500 million. 31% of our bridges are considered deficient, requiring approximately $8 billion to fix them. Another $500 million is needed for dams. The North Carolina Rural Center, in their Water 2020 report, estimated the cost of repairing and upgrading our water systems at $17 billion. Governor Easley's Blue Ribbon Transportation Committee estimated we need to spend $29 billion, and that was back when he was governor, over the next 20 years just to repair and meet the needs for new roads. Almost 15% of our public school students in North Carolina are housed in mobile classrooms, and 46% of our current school facilities need renovation. A recent Federal Communications Commission report shows us tied with Mississippi at the bottom of states with broadband connections. We've got main streets in rural communities across our state that desperately need revitalizations, or else these communities are going to dry up and go away. And we haven't even touched higher education, hospitals, courthouses, jails, public parks, or other infrastructure needs. Mathematics was not one of my better subjects in school, but even I can easily add up over $100 billion in infrastructure needs here in North Carolina. And that number is growing every single year, and we aren't doing anything to address those needs. Much of the public infrastructure that we have in our state was built 30 to 50 years ago. If anything, we're getting further behind. Let me give you an example. In 1989, we approved the North Carolina Highway Trust Fund to improve primary transportation corridors within the state and build loops around several metropolitan areas. It was estimated at that time to cost $8 billion and take 13 years to complete. But in 1998, just 9 years later, the state auditor said we were going to have to add another 23 years and another $12 billion to complete the task. We capped the gas tax, the primary source of revenue. Our vehicles are more fuel efficient, meaning they're buying less gas, and still we've got the highest gas taxes in the southeastern United States. The funding mechanism that we have for road construction and repair and maintenance is obviously not working, but we're not doing anything about it. Here's another. 70% of our state's water systems are municipally owned. Most of them were built 40 years ago. We've got the highest number of small water systems of any state in the nation. 138 of the 214 water systems in towns of fewer than 2,500 residents are losing money and are unable to properly maintain their systems. Few of the water systems, even the other water systems, are actually charging actual cost of service. We've got a public health threat facing us down the barrel if we don't act. We haven't started any large water reservoir projects to meet our growth needs in more than 30 years, which is about, by the way, the length of time it takes to bring one of them online. And as I stated earlier, funds needed to repair and expand water systems are greater than $17 billion. And this doesn't even include a discussion on stormwater and wastewater treatment, which also need a lot of work. Now, maybe you want to argue with my math. Maybe you think we don't need $100 billion in infrastructure improvements. Maybe you think the number is more like $50 billion or $25 billion. You pick a number. The point is, the need is greater than we can meet at this present time. But whatever the number, it's growing daily because we're not addressing it. Now, so far, I suspect I've been preaching to the choir because most folks will agree we've got a big need to improve North Carolina's public infrastructure. What we haven't reached agreement about, what I call the $100 billion question, is how are we going to pay for these improvements? Government is nothing more than a social contract among the citizens of a state, a city, a nation. And our society has typically agreed that one of the public purposes of government is to provide infrastructure. So unless we want to dissolve that social contract, we need to figure out a way to get about the job of rebuilding, expanding public infrastructure. Now, if my boss, my former boss, the late State Treasurer Harlan Boyles, was around today, he'd be telling anybody who would listen that now is the time for our state to engage in a major public infrastructure building and renovation campaign. And he would tell us that we need to buy today for tomorrow's needs. Those of you who remember Harlan will also remember that he was a staunch fiscal conservative, but he also knew when it was time to act. Here's why he would say we need to sell bonds to finance public infrastructure improvements. We have historically low interest rates, and governments like the state of North Carolina with a AAA bond rating can borrow money as cheaply as any of us can remember. We currently owe $7.1 billion in state debt, and the major credit rating agencies consider us a low-debt state. Construction costs are still very reasonable, and we will never likely see a better time than this moment to build. Couple that with the fact that we have the 5th highest unemployment rate in the nation, and we've been stuck in that position for many months. The recovery that a lot of states are experiencing hasn't yet reached us in North Carolina. Ask one of our citizens along the I-85 corridor about how things are, and they'll say, well, they're not good, but they're getting better. You ask a person east of I-95 how things are, and they'll say they're bad and getting desperate. Ask a person in the mountains, and they'll say, well, things are about the same. They've always been pretty bad. A multi-billion-dollar public infrastructure building and renovation program would put tens of thousands of people to work. We've heard it estimated that for every $1 billion we spend in construction money, we're going to create 28,000 new jobs. Now, if this is sounding like a not-so-subtle sales pitch, I'd say you're hearing me correctly. If properly designed and created, a public infrastructure building program would lower our unemployment rate while also updating badly needed public infrastructure in our state. Now, I know there are going to be some people who are going to say, oh yeah, how are we going to pay for all this? Folks, there is still efficiency in government to be realized in the state of North Carolina. We can reduce the cost of operating North Carolina government. And also, with the growth that this program will provide through new jobs, sales taxes, income taxes that will come to our state, we ought to be able to service the debt for this bond program. Doesn't that sound like a win-win situation? Putting people to work and at the same time improving public infrastructure? The truth we don't want to hear is that we're staring down the barrel of an infrastructure crisis in North Carolina. Our history demonstrates all too clearly that when we stepped up to our responsibility and improved our infrastructure, our economy prospered. And when we refused to provide that infrastructure, our economy and the health of our people languished. Are we, as Santayana said, condemned to repeat our history? I want to close with a reminder of Sir Isaac Newton's first law of physics. Newton's first law states that an object at rest tends to remain at rest until acted upon by force. Folks, our public infrastructure is at rest and will stay that way unless we do something to change it. Last Tuesday, I spoke to 250 people who were gathered for the North Carolina Farm Bureau Leadership Conference in Raleigh. And we talked about the public infrastructure need, and I asked for a show of hands. I said, how many of you would be in favor of a public infrastructure bond program to improve infrastructure in our state? Fewer than 5% raised their hands. Friends, we've got a big job ahead of us educating the people of North Carolina. And I want to respectfully ask you to join in this campaign. It's time we took the initiative. We need to tell the story to anyone who will listen that now is time for us to act. We need to get in touch with our elected legislators, our governor, and tell them that it's our time in North Carolina, and it's time to get North Carolina moving forward. They need encouragement. They need backbone. They need to know that if they step out, they'll get support. This is important, and we expect them to act. A new campaign is going to be launched later this year called North Carolina Moving Forward. And I would like to ask that you get involved in this effort. You understand as well as anybody what needs to be done. But as I say, we've got a massive education campaign to do in the public of North Carolina. We can sell this, but it's going to take a lot of work, and we're going to have to all pull together to get it done. Not just because, by the way, you've got a financial stake in it, but all of us have a stake in the future of North Carolina. If we're going to be a positive, vibrant, healthy, and prosperous state, we've got to improve our infrastructure, and there's no better time to do it than right now. It is our time to answer the $100 billion question. Thank you.